What is up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friends Cameron and Bailey.
Hey.
And we're in Bielsen again, bringing you a brand new series called Barriers. Bailey, pray us in, man.
Yep. God, we just pray that in our conversation today, we would, and also anyone joining us, that we would come to see you and understand you more truly, more clearly, and that all the barriers and things that we put up in front of you would just begin to be knocked down. So, Lord, please be with us in this conversation. Please guide our words and fill us with wisdom as we talk. Lord, we love you. We come to you today in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, man. So why is it called Barriers? Well, I kind of stole it from you, so I appreciate that.
You're going to blame it on me, huh?
That's right. Oh, gosh. I didn't think it was that bad. Anyways, so we've talked about...
people who bury other people.
Yeah, right. Those are barriers.
To clarify the spelling.
Be
a much different series.
That's right. Yes. So we talked about, I don't know how many episodes ago, it's probably been like 11 episodes ago or something like that, that you said on a podcast, insofar as there are barriers to people coming to faith, we want the only barrier to be like the tension, I guess, that they have with God.
Their own heart.
Yeah, we don't want to make it any harder for people to accept Jesus.
Yeah, or at least to understand. I think the idea is, what are the barriers that are between people and understanding the gospel, and we can't really affect their hearts except with our witness and by showing them the love of Jesus lived out. But when we're sharing the gospel, the idea is to be as clear as possible and to knock down as many of those barriers as possible that would cause somebody to either misunderstand or reject out of hand the good news.
Right. And so we're going to unpack some of the barriers that we have experienced evangelizing in Norway, some of the things that we've heard from some our Christian partners out here. In fact, a lot of these topics I got from Laga, which was the organization that made that survey that we went through, I think on episode 9, it feels like so long ago.
Yeah.
And so we're going to unpack some of these topics, and these are really important issues that can make it very difficult to accept the gospel.
Well, and this is some of the stuff also that we have, 'cause I don't want to discount your guys' own experience, right? So we've been in Norway several times on evangelistic efforts.
Yeah.
And so this is also some of the stuff that we've run into as we've talked with Norwegians about the important stuff. You remember when we did that survey, however many episodes ago it was, like that's what we talked to people about. And I think this is some of the stuff that they struggle with that makes it difficult for the gospel even to get to their ears, never mind touch their heart.
Yeah.
And like the interesting thing with it too is like you guys know the terms and you know all the like textbook definitions and everything of these barriers that we're going to talk about. But like you run into these barriers with people and they have no idea what the terms are that Christians have given them. So yeah, it'll be fun to...
That's always the struggle, is because a lot of people, what they do is when they want to answer these questions, these really important objections, when they want to answer them, what they do is they go and study the stuff. They read the textbooks and they learn the terms. But the thing is that people on the streets don't know these terms. Right. Not everyone you talk to is going to be a philosopher or has read the Reasonable Faith.
So people, we go to the literature, of course, and the literature has names for things and categories and like boxes you can put stuff in and isms and all of that. And most people don't know what they are and aren't interested in isms. So you're saying,
most people don't care.
That sounds like postmodernism. And they're like, what? We'll talk about it. I'm not going to let the cat out of the hat. Cat out of the hat, cat out of the bag.
Spoiler
Pull the rabbit
alert.
out of the hat.
Yeah.
It's coming. That sounds like postmodernism. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I appreciate that insight, Bailey. Like not everyone goes to the literature and sees all the neat categories and argumentation. They just wonder about these things, and they come right. So everyone comes to the gospel with their own baggage and the things they presuppose about the world and their judgments about the world, and our assumptions about the world and things that are important. And then I say academics, but not even necessarily that. Just people like to systemize thought. They come in and build these neat little categories and then start arguing about that stuff. So
Yeah,
absolutely.
And then, like, as a Christian who wants to and like attempts to share the gospel with people, and then runs into these barriers, like, it helps me when just like we sit around a table and talk about this stuff, because the more and more I like understand the literature and all that kind of stuff, the less when I'm confronted with one of those barriers when talking to someone, the less it's like I'm starting from ground zero.
Yeah.
Like I know I can identify, okay, this is the problem of evil they brought up, or, and then like you have a basis to build from instead of like trying to sift through what they're saying and draw like a whole argument from there.
Well, and try and figure the whole thing out on the fly. Like, it's better to have spent some time thinking well about the problem, because people wonder stuff. Like you brought it up, Jacob. Like, we believe some weird stuff.
We do,
and it becomes less weird. It's just like how if you lived in the stinky house, like you never noticed it, and like eventually it doesn't smell funny to you anymore. So the stuff that we believe that's weird, that just seems totally normal because we're in it. But to other people, it's weird. They don't know how to make sense of that. And so if you combine that thing with the gospel, so you say, well, here's the gospel. Well, that even makes less sense. And so I think the hope is always to be able to help people to make sense and understand. Like I want to make sure that you understand the gospel. And if you reject it, that whole thing is about your relationship with God.
Right.
But at least don't want it to be because you misunderstand.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I'm looking forward to unpacking these topics with you guys in a way. So if anyone who is watching has found yourself kind of in that situation, like you're evangelizing to someone and you haven't yet read the literature, I'd encourage you to read the literature after you listen to this series. So let's jump into one of the ones that I know resonates with you really well. One of the ones that we're really familiar with, at least from where we come from, is this kind of issue of science and faith.
Yeah.
So this kind of conception that people have, I hear it all the time, that science and Christianity are at odds with each other.
Yeah.
That you either believe in God or you believe in science.
Yeah.
What do we think about that? Do we think where did that come from?
Gosh, where it came from, I don't know, but I see no good reason to believe it. And smart people have written books about it, and they're just forgive me because I don't mean to be flippant, but it's just nonsense. There's just no reason. I see no good reason to think about the world that way. I remember listening to John Lennox, who's a brilliant Christian thinker. He's a philosopher and scientist and mathematician, just a wonderful, brilliant man. But he makes the point, something like 50% of Nobel Prize winners in the sciences are sincere believers in God. So it's like, I think it would be news to them that you have to stop believing in God if you want to do science well.
Yeah.
And so the issue about whether or not you believe in God just doesn't seem to be straightforwardly a scientific one, because there are the sort of the top scientists who've ever been. Lots of them were sincere religious believers, and lots of them are sincere atheists, and lots are somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But that's to show kind of that the problem isn't what you believe about science. The problem is what you're believing about other stuff.
That's good. But so what about this kind of like, I'm going to bring up an ism.
Yes.
But
it's hard not to.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, but let's unpack it. So, I mean, so that we can evangelize in English. There's this kind of idea called scientism that seems to kind of be this very popular these days, especially like, well, on social media, if you talk to anyone about science and faith. What is scientism, since you're a real philosopher?
Oh my gosh, please don't accuse me of that. Because there are real philosophers. Anyways, so scientism, not nobody, but very few people just say yes, no, you can't, a person, I'm sorry, I'm stammering because what do you call someone who affirms scientism? It's not a scientist, like that's a different thing. But anyways, very few people say, I affirm scientism. But nevertheless, it's something that is thoroughly widespread. And the idea is something like, well, no, if you want information about the reality, right? If you want to know truth about the world, go look to the scientists. And that's just absolutely true. I mean, that's who has the authority in our culture and across the world, by and large, are the guys in the white coats, right? when the scientist speaks, you listen and you say, okay, so the science, and we've spent 2 years or something going through the whole COVID thing,
right?
And we keep hearing about people who, I believe the science, you're rejecting the science, and there's the science, and science says, and science, and the science. But science is the thing we're supposed to listen to. It will give us truth about the world, and there are degrees of believing that. So on the very extreme end, somebody might say, and people do, say something like, the only way to get valid information about the world is by means of science, whatever they mean by science. And most people haven't thought very deeply about that. But whatever they mean by science, that's the only way to get good information and truth about the world. And that can't be true because it's straightforwardly self-defeating, right?
Yeah.
So the only way to get good information about the world, or the only way to get at truth is by science. And you go, okay, can I prove that scientifically? And you can't,
right?
And so that statement itself is a statement of, it's a statement of philosophy, and it's a really bad statement of really bad philosophy, the kind of thing that wouldn't get you very far. And in fact, there's a related philosophy called logical positivism that was popular among intelligentsia for a while, and then just got destroyed in the 20th century because it's self-defeating. So that's on the strong side, the one end of scientism. A little bit weaker, you might call something like weak scientism. That doesn't say science is the only access we have to truth, but it really is the best access we have to truth. So if it's not in the sciences, you can more or less dismiss it, or if there's no scientific foundation, you don't really need to take it seriously. And maybe there are some other ancillary things we can find out about the world by means of other ways of investigation, but science is the best. That's how we get the best truth. And the problem with that is, well, there are lots of problems with that, but among them, I can think of a couple of things. And I'd like to shout out to one of my heroes, J.P. Moreland, who talks. If you want to know more, just YouTube J.P. Moreland Scientism. You'll get tons of stuff. Yeah. And he's a brilliant genius.
He has a great book on it. Yeah. That's not very long.
Yeah. He's amazing. Yeah. But there are at least two problems. One of them is there are things that we know with much better justification than we get for anything, or at least most things in science. So there, for example, JP makes a claim that there are ethical claims, ethical truths that we know and have much better rational support for than scientific truths. And do I have time to give a quick example?
Yes.
So, okay, go for it. So one example might be the ethical claim that it's wrong to torture babies. Right, and you guys, I make...
That's a very extreme example, yes.
Well, I use baby torturing all the time when we talk about ethical claims because it's so obviously wrong.
Right.
So it's the case that we know that it's wrong to torture babies, but we also know, science has delivered to us knowledge about the existence of the electron. Well, most people don't have any idea how to know that electrons exist or what they are, or that they're real. And now that we have quantum mechanics, they seem to not make sense and do really weird things. But the electron hasn't been one thing. There have been several ideas about what the electron is. And you have wave theorists, and you have particle theorists. So anyways, you have all these different conceptions of the electron that have changed a whole lot in the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years. And so you can imagine, it's at least possible, in the next 50 years, I don't take any credit, but the scientists, the smart guys who are doing the hard work, will discover new things that will change our conception of the electron. That's conceivable. It's happened a lot in the last 50 years. It is inconceivable that in the next 50 years we're going to learn more things that will turn over it's wrong to torture babies.
Sure.
Right? There's nothing new that we could even possibly learn that would make us less justified in believing that. So there's one problem, that there are at least ethical, non-scientific claims that we can know with greater certainty and more rational support than some scientific ones. And the second one is it tends to be not self-defeating, but at least self-undermining, in the sense that even the weaker form of scientism relies on non-scientific presuppositions, and science can't be stronger than the presuppositions that it rests on. And even that kind of scientism, it has no tools to assess the presuppositions underneath. So things like the world is going to be the same tomorrow as it was today, and what kinds of things affect experimentation, right? So you might, a scientist is running an experiment, and no one runs in and says, "Wait a minute, what color undies are you wearing?" Because that might affect what you're mixing in the test tubes. Right? He goes, "No, my color of my undies has nothing to do with whatever experiment I'm doing." Well, how do you know? You sort of have to. I mean, maybe you have good reasons to believe it, but it's sort of an assumption. But there's no real that's maybe a bad example for my point, but there's the point is that there are these assumptions about the world that you can't test scientifically,
Sure.
and you really have no tools to evaluate given your own sense of the value of science or its necessity for getting at truth. And so therefore it kind of undermines itself. It just gives you no good reason to believe it. So there are no good reasons really to believe it, and there are really good reasons to disbelieve it, because at least we have some non-scientific claims that offer much more in the way of rational support than most, maybe not most, but at least some important scientific claims.
I'm really curious. So I want to know, of course, maybe any thoughts you have on everything Cam just said. That was wonderful. Thank you. But you actually, at some point, went to college to study physics, right? And so what do you think kind of about that first issue with scientism that Cam addressed? Was that there are fundamental issues in life and fundamental questions about life that science just can't address. It just has nothing to say about it. These are really important questions. I have a couple examples that we can brainstorm about, but what do you think about that?
Yeah. So now my thoughts are a lot different than they were when I was a guy going to college to be a physicist.
I hope so.
Like I always say that I was a really bad atheist or a really bad scientist or whatever that I wanted to be back then.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh gosh, it's tough not to sound like arrogant saying it, but like, I was just so foolish, and like all of my beliefs and like reasoning behind like, because I was totally one of the what you were describing, like science and God just can't be meshed together. Like science conflicts with God, and I don't know, just like the God stuff is Santa Claus stuff.
Yeah.
And science stuff is you're working with real things. We're we're dealing in reality here. So I really just like treated it at that level back then. And nowadays, like I hear what you're saying, and I'm like, it's obviously foolishness.
Yeah.
I can't even try to reason for like a defense of why science and the tools of science can even be used as an attempt to make sense of things like morality and just the real things that like constitute the world. So today I think it's like rubbish and foolish, but back then it was like I think it just caught on because it's when you're like raised in a secular setting, and it wasn't like my parents shielded us from any sort of religion or faith.
Sure.
It was just we only, I don't know, dealt in terms of what's physical and So I don't know. It's really tough to describe.
Well, what I'm kind of hearing is it's like now that you've come to Christ, it's like the scales have fallen off your eyes, and you're like, oh, of course, science can't explain everything. So I have a couple examples here. So I think science cannot answer the purpose of life, what happens when we die, where do we come from ultimately. Probably in a scientific sense, it can explain how babies are made, right? How I should love my neighbor is one example. So one of the examples I used, I was talking with our world religions teacher, Temeskin. We love you, Temeskin. That the example I always use is science can teach you how to create nuclear bombs. Science cannot tell you whether or not you should drop them.
Yeah.
And
so we've run into that here. Not nuclear bombs, of course, but I think I think as I talk to people, there's this idea that I'm going to get back to exactly what you said. I promise. I'm just going to start a little bit to the left and come back.
No, sure.
But the idea is like religion is how people used to try and explain the world, and as humanity advances intellectually. And people we don't get smarter, but we learn from our previous generation. So as we understand more about the world, the God theories go away, and the natural ones because we understand how the world works. So thunder isn't God bowling, right? Or whatever. And people have told us something like that. It's like we know how the world works now.
Yeah.
Right. So religion, if you want that, that's fine. But we just know that that's not a part of the world. And there's a problem with that. And the first one is that's just not how humanity has proceeded. That's just a fault. Like there's no historian of science who would tell you that's been the march of human sort of academic investigation is, we used to blame everything on gods, and now we know science. Of course, there's some of that.
Well, one of the ways that people put it, I've heard this several times, is that as our knowledge of science grows bigger, the need for God or the perceived need of God gets smaller and smaller.
And that's completely wrong-headed. That's not what's happening at all. And in fact, if you read the scriptures, there's really nothing in there that says, well, let me explain why the world is the way that... let me explain thunder, right? God bowling. It's like, no. It tells you about who God... First of all, the Bible presupposes the existence of God. And then it tells us how he wants to relate to us. And there's some content in the pages of scriptures that interacts with the natural world and where it came from. And we can use some... we can marshal some scientific approach to understand whether that stuff is true. And that's really interesting. But nevertheless, this idea that as our scientific knowledge grows, the need for God shrinks is just nonsense. That's never how it. I'm like, you should say that to Aristotle, right? So Aristotle kind of plants the seeds of science, and then we start to really fill out call it a scientific method. I don't like referring to it as that because there is no scientific method. If you're listening to this, you're going to think that I'm full of it, but it's true. Study some philosophy of science. There is no the scientific method. Whatever it is, it's more of a, like science, it's one of those things more like you know it when you see it than being able to define it at the outset and understand, is this science that I'm doing? But anyways, we can use the tools of science to look at the world. And I just forgot. Oh, so if you told Aristotle, right, that you have this religious view of the world, and you're replacing, as you learn about science, you replace the religious superstition. That's nonsense. And then sort of in modern time. And by the way, like in the cradle, that's in like the incubator of the church. Science came to life. What we might refer to as modern science or seems like modern science. But there's a lot of those people were religious believers, and it never occurred to them. People were very, very smart, by the way. It never occurred to them that what they were doing was replacing the need for God with mechanisms, and that's, I think the mistake that makes, I promise I'm going to get back to the thing we were talking about.
That's fine.
But the mistake that makes is it confuses mechanism and agency. So John Lennox, a fellow I was talking about before, he uses an example where you might ask, why is the tea kettle boiling? And you could give a really interesting physical scientific answer about the motion of particles and the transfer of energy and the flow of energy from high energy density to low energy density. And you have and then what happens to water and how you break. I think, is it hydrogen bonds with water? Anyways, you break the bonds between water molecules and turns into water vapor, and therefore it expands very many times, and blah, 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 blah. Right? You could give a really great, and it's beautiful. And it's amazing. So don't hear us for 1 second saying, science doesn't tell you stuff. Religion, something like that. Like, no, science is wonderful, but it can offer you this kind of explanation. So why is the tea kettle boiling? You could give a wonderful, beautiful, physical explanation that you could boil down to like an equation on a page. That's genius. Or you could say, because I wanted to make some tea. And having one answer doesn't replace the other. I can't say, well, no, all that physical scientific stuff you just wrote is nonsense. The answer is I wanted tea. And you can't say, well, no, I reject your explanation that you wanted tea. The explanation can be derived from these equations. You go, no.
That's funny.
And so I had that same realization. My wife and I, we were visiting New York City, and we were walking up inside the Statue of Liberty. And there's lots of, it's an engineering masterpiece. It's really beautiful and wonderful. And all of the upgrades and repairs and things they've done over the years in order to keep it standing and have been really amazing too. And so as you're walking up the stairs and inside this thing, there are little plaques and signs telling you about the kinds of things they've done inside the Statue of Liberty. And that's kind of when it struck me. I just kind of went, like I can know all of this stuff. And it would be silly for me to know everything about the design and implementation and engineering and whatever to make and say therefore nobody designed it. Like we have no need of a designer anymore. We don't have to understand. We don't have to understand why it exists. We can just explain. We can explain all of these how questions. And if you add up all of the hows, that you get a why. And you go, no, there's room in the world for both of those explanations. Yeah. And I think you make that category error when you when you expect that science can answer every question, and it can't. So the profound thing, Jacob, about the questions that you presented us with, those are the ones that you start thinking about before you're ever even really doing science. Where did I come from? Where am I going? What, if anything, happens when I die? Why am I here? And should I remain here? Like that kind of stuff. And someone has put it like that's how you can tell the limits of science, is it can't answer the questions that 5-year-olds have.
Well, can I? How about I throw this? And play advocate for a second for the devil.
Okay, good.
John Lennox had a debate with a gentleman named Peter Atkins.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. If a picture says 1,000 words, your facial expression
I'm not impressed
does.
by Peter Atkins' philosophical acumen. It's really bad. Genius scientist, terrible philosopher.
Sorry, Peter. But
sorry.
You need to repent and put your faith in Jesus. During the debate, Peter says, faith answers stupid questions, and science answers real questions. And so I think what he's getting at, and something I want to throw in both your guys' laps, actually, is that, okay, so why questions exist? Like, where did I come from? What's the purpose?
Yeah.
But those are like stupid questions. So it's kind of like, I heard Richard Dawkins say this as well. I just mentioned 2 people from the New Atheist movement, which has a lot of vitriol and is very, on that scientism kind of bandwagon. Richard Dawkins said one time in a lecture, he's like, it's like looking at a mountain and asking, why is that mountain there? That's a dumb question. So Christians...
Oh my God. Oh, you got me all wound up now.
Well, how about Bailey go first, if you don't mind?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just going to stay all tense over here.
So, all right, Christian, why questions are just stupid questions? How would you answer that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, the first thing it makes me think of is like you can probably find 5 guys who spend their lives like struggling with the question of like I don't know, what are the stars doing out there, or like questions like water's boiling, like I need to figure out what that process is, what's happening there.
Yeah.
So there are like a handful of people who spend their whole lives like just burdened by that question until they find the answer. But like the questions that you posed, what happens after death, those kind of questions, like every single human being is confronted with those questions. If they're honest, then every single human being wonders, where did I come from? Is there a purpose to, I'm here, I exist. Like, is there a purpose to this? How did I get here? Where do I go when existence as I know it stops? Like those kinds of questions. And even like the moral behaviors, like torturing babies and things like that. Like we're troubled by those things. And like if you're not, then we
know
have a
you're
medical
broken,
term for
right?
you.
Yeah.
Or we have a medical term for you, like if you're not troubled by those kinds of things. So there's just like, there's an unavoidable burden. And if you say those are stupid questions, like I would just point at that and say, can you really tell me like that those questions, what happens when you're dead? Can you really tell me you don't get asked that question by every single person in your life, and that you haven't considered that question yourself? But how many people can you tell me are burdened by the question of where do atoms come from?
What's a complete physical explanation for the boiling of the water?
Well, that would be kind of like to be a jerk. I would just be like, well, if you're saying that those scientific questions are the real important ones, like, no, they're not.
Yeah,
like,
you're just wrong.
Stop lying, they're not.
Well, I think, to your point, I think if you ask the question, like, what's the purpose of my life? That's not a stupid question, because the answer to that question has significant implications for how you live your life.
Right.
So if you think that we live in a purposeless, creatorless universe, and that that you can simply explain us in merely physical terms.
Right. The universe is a chemical reaction, right? And so is your life and all of your desires.
Yeah. Then it doesn't matter if you love your neighbor or torture him for fun, is what I've heard. Dr. David Wood talks about that when he shares his testimony. So he's very public about the fact that he medically in his brain struggles with psychopathy. He is a diagnosed psychopath. And he's like, I was an atheist, and I never really understood why some atheists decided to love their neighbor, because I figured, well, if we're merely physical, if there is no purpose to life, then it doesn't matter if you love your neighbor or torture him for fun. And that is not an unimportant question. That is not a stupid question.
Right.
It matters. It matters what you believe about where you came from and why you're here.
Well, okay, so I've got a few things I'm going to say to Peter Atkins because he's for sure going to see this. First one is, I just reject, like when you say, well, science asks important questions. And I just go, man, are you kidding me? So think about all the money that humanity has spent sending a robot to Mars to find out what its dirt is like. That doesn't affect how I live at all. I understand that there are people who think that there are people for whom that is important, but for almost everybody, in fact for them too, it really doesn't make a difference in as far as a significant difference in the way that you live. Nevertheless, there are people who are hugely driven, and our tax money is taken from us to fund these kinds of projects.
That's right.
Right. So it's important enough that we say this is part of the public good, and everyone has to pitch in so that we can put humans on the moon. You know, what? Why? Well, so they can bring some rocks and dirt home. We have rocks and dirt. What does that matter? I don't mean to belittle what those things are, but to say that that's an important question. But why am I here, and how should I treat people, and how do I know that those are unimportant and foolish questions? That's just a stupid thing to say. That's such a dumb and arrogant thing to say. Secondly, I would say, then why are you doing science? Right? So he goes, science asks the important questions. I go, okay, well, why are you doing it?
Right. What's the scientific journal that publishes why we do science?
Right. So not only is it self-defeating, but secondly, he would tell you something about because it's meaningful and it's the purpose of his life. Right. He's going to say because there are these foolish questions, but I do science. You go, why do you do science? And it's going to be an answer to one of these foolish questions. So that's it's just nonsensical to say. And then finally, not finally, but the finally for me for now is there's this reductionist view of the world. So I said a few minutes ago, I talked about if you can add up all the how questions, like it adds up to a why, and it doesn't.
It doesn't.
So what you do is you reject what they call teleology, that anything has a purpose or a design, and you reject that in the sciences, and you say, listen, every why question is actually a how question in disguise. When you say something like, why is the sun hot? You're really asking, how is the sun hot? And you can answer that. Or why does the heart beat? You can answer how the heart beats, but not really why. But here's what nonsense that reduces to is and I mean this literally, this is not a caricature or whatever, this is literally and truly what people say and believe, and you can see what a cost it is when you say, if I say, why does the heart beat? If you take that line that science, or that the only legitimate questions in the world are how questions, which by the way, how could you know that? That's a philosophical question, not a scientific one. You say that,
I love it.
the only questions in the world are how questions, then the purpose of the heart has no purpose. And you say, why does the heart beat? You can't say in order to pump blood to all the places that the heart pumps blood to. Right. That's an illegitimate answer. The only answer you can give is a mechanical answer about how the heart beats. There is no why. And you go, wait a minute, there really seems to be a why here. Because you move the problem back a step, right? So you can tell me, I say, why does the heart beat? And then you give me an answer in terms of pressure and electrical impulse and rhythm and all of that. Really interesting answer, but no part of the answer is in order to get blood to the parts of the body that need it. And so you go, okay, well, I get that, but why does it do that? And then for someone to go, why is actually a stupid question? We're only interested in how questions. And you go, we recognize it in every other area of our life, right? If we're in a crime scene and you ask the detective, why did he murder that guy? And he goes, well, we've got some blood analysis over here, and we've got some DNA results, and we've got some fingerprints.
Skin tissue does when knives are stabbed into it.
Right. And here's what the bullet looks like, and here's how you can tell which gun it was fired from. This one, it turns out. And you go, that's really interesting. Why did he kill him? And he goes, well, why is actually a stupid question. Yeah. No, actually, it turns out the law is really concerned with why.
Yeah, right.
Right? The law is really, and the reason the law is really concerned with why is because that is maybe the majority of our human experience. If why is a stupid question, then science is a stupid enterprise because there's no reason to do it. You say, we're going to go answer all of the how questions. You go, why are you going to go answer all of the how questions? Well, because they're the important ones. It's like, okay, how do you know that? Like, false. And then how do you know that thing? It's just basket of nonsense.
That's such a good. Did you take that from anywhere? That if why is a stupid question, then science is a stupid enterprise?
Well, as far as I know, I just invented that, but I'm sure I got it from. If you think it's smart, I'm sure it's not mine.
Well, I want to sell merch with that, because that is so good. And I think we've kind of been riffing a lot on that. I think the other side of the horse is to say that science isn't important. I have everything I need just from faith, and so this kind of moves into one of the things we definitely want to talk about. Science is important because of the Christian worldview.
Right.
Is because the why questions have answers is why science is important.
Yeah.
So historically speaking, Christianity is no stranger to science.
No,
right?
No, not in the slightest. And in fact, almost universally, historians of science will tell you that it's because science was incubated inside a Christian worldview and inside the university, which was a Christian institution, and inside the church for all of her foibles and mistakes. Because science was incubated and hatched inside a Christian worldview, that's why we have it, and that's why it's such a robust toolbox for investigating the world. And there's this, so we have the Dark Ages, right? The Middle Ages or medieval period, whatever they call the Dark Ages. And people think it's called the Dark Ages because we didn't learn anything then. It's like humanity was making progress, then the Dark Ages happened, and then science emerged. And that's just false.
Right.
If that's what you believe, then frankly, you're ignorant of history. That's not at all what was happening. And it was actually the Middle Ages and the so-called Dark Ages where science was beginning to develop on the back of really, really, really robust and exciting and interesting philosophy. And that's why until recently, all the sciences have been called the natural philosophies. And I think it's, you asked earlier, why has it become this way? Frankly, I think it's because, one of the reasons is because scientists have stopped studying philosophy. So when I was studying in graduate school, I was very close to doing a PhD in philosophy of science. That was the area that I most wanted to study. And my wife is a science teacher, a really, really good one. And I love science. My mentor in high school, Ritter, what's up, is a scientist. I love it. What's happened is scientists have stopped doing philosophy, and they don't understand what's underneath the science that they talk about, and it can be frustrating for people who have thought well about these things. So they offer opinions about science and about what it's able to do and what it's not able to do, or they say things like the questions worth answering are the kinds you can investigate scientifically. Well, they just haven't thought hard about the science. So I was in a philosophy of science class. I had a friend in my class, and her bachelor's degree, I think, was in biomedical engineering. And she was going to pursue a master's degree in the same field, but she stopped and did a different master's degree. And one of her courses was with me in philosophy of science. And every class period, she was just blown away. She was like, I learned none of this as an undergraduate. And every undergraduate science student needs to take philosophy of science. And the same thing happened with Ritter, who I talked about. We opened up a book about, it's called Christianity and the Nature of Science, another J.P. Moreland book. But it starts with the scientific method. Okay, what is the scientific method? And he told me, what JP does is he says, here's one description of the scientific method, and here's why that doesn't work. And here's another description of the scientific method, and here's why that doesn't work. And he goes, I found myself every page going, and he's been teaching science for 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
And he goes, I open the page and go, yeah, that's what the scientific method is. And then JP destroys it and says, that can't be right. Oh, gosh, okay, let's look at this other one. Okay, yeah, this other one corrects the problems that were destroyed. No, oh, man. And he goes, I've never thought about that stuff. I've been teaching science all this time. And so he's an expert, not only as a scientist, but he's an expert in teaching science never is not fair to say, but hasn't been exposed to the material that might make you, that would help you to understand what science is doing and why I think it's a good way of getting true information about the world.
Yeah, well, very few people have.
Yeah.
So it's not unfair at all to say that. I think there's this saying that goes that science is a slave to philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for those reasons that I think you really articulated. I'm really curious, Bailey, on any of your thoughts on anything that Cam said as well, but I also kind of want to put this in your lap. Do you find that now that you've come to faith, the scales have fallen off and now you kind of see the foolishness of the past, do you have more appreciation for the discipline of science now that you know Jesus than before? What do you think about that?
Yeah, Yeah, 1,000,000%.
Yeah.
Now I recognize like the reason for science, like you were saying, in the first place, like is founded in like us knowing God exists and He created the world. Because it's like Whitney talks about how she loves to go on walks and just like some of the most like close moments she has with God are just when she sees creation.
Right.
And like for her, she, is a legit scientist, so she knows a ton of the details behind when she sees a star. Like I'm a pathetic little pop atheist, pop scientist. Yeah. So I see a star and I'm like, whoa, that thing moves. And inertia is a word that is involved. Like, I have a few like really low level words that I can tie to it, but she has tons of understanding.
Yeah.
So it just like, it's a tool in our like spirituality with God to like help us appreciate and understand. Or like, so when I consider the question of like, why do all the planets and everything that's not Earth, why does all that exist? Tons of people would say like, well, there have to be aliens or there has to be something out there.
Yeah.
And for me, like now as a Christian who has a little bit of science in his pocket, I see that and I just like, the obvious answer in my mind is God just wants to tell us who He is. Like, it's not that He wanted to make tons of planets with tons of different species or whatever. Like the heavens and how unfathomable the size of the universe is simply there for us to understand that God is beyond us. And just to have that as a constant witness to us, like look up and wow, I'm tiny, this guy's giant. And like, I can know the character of God simply by examining creation. So I think, science ought to be a tool that we have in our spirituality to help us appreciate and love God more.
Yeah.
And also a defense, like we should be able to use science as a defense or an apologetic for God.
If science tells us true things about the world,
Yeah.
then it's only helping us discover more about God. So I think, I'll interrupt you real quick. I'm sorry, I've already done that. But what I want to say to my Christian brothers and sisters is do not be afraid of science.
Right.
It's a gift from God. It is a marvel and achievement in human thought. It's amazing. I think we should use it until the wheels fall off, right? Absolutely make use of science. But don't make the mistakes about applying science to things that it can't do. I mean, that's like asking how long is a gallon. It's like a ruler is the wrong tool. You're doing the wrong thing, right? So don't try and torture science or either make the mistake of trying to apply science to things that it can't look at, right? Because and then don't make the mistake of saying that because science doesn't see it, it doesn't exist or it isn't important. Because science doesn't answer those simple childlike questions that you brought up earlier. Why am I here? Where are we going? What am I doing? What does this matter at all?
And just to like tie that to your question a little bit earlier, like where does Christianity and science, like did those two just recently start to collaborate or so a couple verses.
Please.
Jeremiah 10:12 says, "It is He who made the earth by His power, who established the world by His wisdom, and by His understanding stretched out the heavens." Job 38 says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding, who determined its measurements." And there are like tons of verses where you can find, for the person who's trying to say that God and science are separate, like it's a really confusing thing where the Bible, for some reason, blames God's wisdom or God's smarts or God's understanding on, like, it says that that's linked to Him creating the earth. So, like, Christianity, just in the book that we read, from the start, has linked God creating and therefore, like, science and how things work, the, like, blueprints of the kingdom are linked to God's wisdom. And like the Bible puts forth not just a God who's a creator, but it puts forth a God who's a designer and like has intention and mastery and technique and skills, and like He designs with intention and with thought behind it.
I think John Lennox comments on this kind of idea when John Lennox makes a note of when God commanded Adam to name the animals. The way that he puts it is God invents taxonomy right there. And I mean, it's true as far as it goes, but I think, but the idea that God is not afraid of us studying his creation.
No, and Christians should not be either. I'm gonna say that so many times. Christians should not be either. Go study God's creation.
I like this verse. Those were wonderful. In fact, as he was talking, my mind immediately went to Job and God's rebuke of Job.
Yeah.
This is one I found the other day. From Psalm 111, verse 2. Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them, in God's works. And so God gave us a world to go investigate and study and learn. And it's like, in science class, and biology is the one that resonates the most with me. When I'm like, do you know how complicated all of the trillion of cells that are in CAM right now are? It's like how complex, intelligent, and it's literally amazing. It is literally engineered.
And it doesn't matter
incredible.
how small you get. So you see a cell and you go, whoa, that's crazy. Zoom in as far as you want. It doesn't matter how far you zoom in, it gets more and more amazing. So like, I know a scientist who he studies metabolic pathways. So he zooms way into the cell just to see how energy goes across this one kind of circuit. And it's incredible. It's got error correction, and it's got efficiency built in, and you can see so you can suss out design in a energy pathway, and he goes, it's there. In fact, it's more efficient than what humans tend to design. And then you zoom into that thing, and
what do you know? God's better,
right? And that's just to say that's true at every scale, right? You zoom out to the universe and you look at that thing, you go, whoa! Like, look how this. If you look at it like a machine, like look at that, look at how it works, and it doesn't matter how far you zoom in, it's amazing. At no point does it just become. I mean, you zoom into the atom, right? There's no point where it's just stuff running into stuff. At every point, it's absolutely divine.
One of the things in science class back in high school that really struck me when we were studying, it was chemistry. And I never really, it was in high school, and how could I? I'd ever really studied chemistry before, so I was excited to do that. We were talking about how atoms, and at the core of an atom are protons and neutrons. And the science teacher was like, what are protons? And I'm like, okay, well, they're positive, like, energy. And they're like, doesn't positive energy repel each other? Like, you need positive and negative, like in a magnet, right, for them to stick? And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, it does. So what holds it together? And I'm like, I don't know, what does hold it together? And he's like, well, the name for it is called strong nuclear force. I'm like, really? So the name for it is literally just strong force. It's just a really strong force that holds it together. And there's no real explanation for it, I don't think.
Well, I think there is. We just haven't discovered what it is. So that we know there. I mean, there's no explanation for so much of it. Well, no explanation yet, but the more we learn. So, okay, so where does that force come from? You go, well, you have positive things and other positive things. When you get them close to each other, they do this. And you go, yeah, why? I go, we don't ask why questions. We ask how questions. And you call it magnetic force or whatever. And of course, we get closer and closer to answers. What's funny is the same people who promote this sort of scientific view of the world, where they go, listen, your God hypothesis is just a stand-in for I don't know. And as we learn more, we have fewer of these I don't knows, right? As we know, you can throw these I don't knows away. But in science, we are not so arrogant. We're humble enough just to go, I don't know, but it's really interesting, and I'm going to go find out. And then you hear about the strong nuclear force, and you're like, all you did was put a name on a thing you don't understand. All you did was call it something. And if we can call it something and we can measure it indirectly, then somehow it's scientific. And that's fine. I agree. By the way, I think that is legitimate science, and I think it's wonderful. But it goes too far as to say that now you've explained something about reality. What you have uncovered is another mystery that now you get to have fun to go and investigate. And one of the thinkers who I like a whole lot says it's like we're in this, like God made for us this huge sandbox and playground to like dig around in and look at. You guys remember that when you were a kid? You just go in the backyard and just dig a hole, and there's some weird bug where if you blow on it, it curls up in a ball, and you just God's left us this whole universe to do that with. So I love, Bailey, your conviction that we look in the universe and it just all tells us like who God is. And that's true. Go spend a day looking at pictures that the Hubble has taken, and you just go, whoa, like God, like, whoa. God did that thing. Or
magnets, how do they work?
Or you look at the red spot on Jupiter, and you go, okay, that's a storm that's been raging for at least 500 years, and we really want to explain it, and we just can't yet. And it's just another explanation of stuff that God's doing, ultimately because he values us, right? We can look at the universe and say, that thing is so huge, and I'm tiny, I'm a speck, I'm whatever. That's true in a physical sense. But in terms of value to God who made us, like that just shows us how much of a universe he's willing to invent and design and create and manage and maintain the existence of in order to give us a world where we can know him and understand him. And so that's how I see it too, Bailey. Is like, you question whether God exists, go look at the whole universe, like the whole. And what does Scripture say about the heavens? Right, the heavens declare God's glory. Right.
If you want
it. No, it's okay. Why don't you read it?
From a psalm from David, the heavens declare the glory of God. Their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. So I like that the expanse, the whole extent of the heavens, which how big is the universe? My goodness.
Well, and David
tells of God's glorious work of his hands.
And he goes on to say that the heavens pour out wisdom and knowledge.
Every day they pour forth speech, and without saying a word, they're basically singing.
It's amazing. So Christians, be scientists. You can glorify and honor God with the more truth you know about God, the better you can love him. The more we understand God truly, the more able we are to love and appreciate and get close to him. Do not be afraid of the sciences. If you are interested in science, go and do it well.
Yeah, and speaking of Christian scientists, I actually have some examples that I think are really telling. They're really revealing. The oldest example I could find it comes from the 12th century from Germany. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, I think is how you pronounce
Hildy.
that. Yeah, Hildy, the old Hildy. From the 12th century, she was a nun who practiced medicine in Germany and wrote journals about medicine. And that was the oldest example I could find of a Christian scientist. But then you've got some names, these names really everyone's familiar with. And interestingly enough, if you're a scientist, you have to be familiar with these names. Robert Boyle, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, all believed in God, all believed in the Bible as the Word of God. They were Christians, but they came up and discovered things that are foundational to the way that everyone understands science. The laws of motion, Pascal's law, the Boyle's law. My goodness.
There's a multitude. There are so many names. And there are plenty of brilliant scientists who don't believe in God. But you can't just dismiss. You can't say we've learned science and therefore we don't need God anymore. That's not what any of these people thought they were up to. Isaac Newton, right, when he was formulating systematizing gravity, like he named gravity, and it's named gravity because of how heavy it is. Dun-dun-dun. Because what a heavy burden it is to because he's understanding this thing about God's creation that no one has understood before. And so they never said, well, we're answering how questions. They're going, we're answering how questions, and it's giving us insight about the why questions. They didn't just say flush the why question. Well, I guess they weren't flushing. Throw the why questions into the pot or into the chamber pot or whatever. They didn't get rid of them. And by the way, that lineage of Christian scientists continues into the modern age, including now. So very brilliant scientists now, several of whom I am honored to count among my friends. I don't know if they count me among their friends, but I'm glad to put them on my list. But even up to so we have Lemaitre, who helped Einstein do the math to understand relativity as that evolved. Einstein couldn't have given, and that would change the way that everybody understood the universe as he came out with special and general theories of relativity. That couldn't have happened without a priest who was working because he believes that he's investigating God's world. I think it was Lewis who said something like, we look at the universe and we expect law in nature. And did you get that?
I have it right here.
And the reason we expect law in nature is because we expect there to be a legislator. Is that close?
Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator.
Right.
I think that's about the best way to put
Well,
it.
and think about it. There's no reason to believe on its face that today is going to be the same as tomorrow, or that experiments should be regular, or that you should measure the speed of light and every day it's the same, or the weak nuclear force, or the strong force, or the right. There's no reason to believe you have there's no constraint. There's no logical constraint that would mean the world has to be regular the way that it is. And that's why people, even Einstein, said that we look into like mathematics is the mind of God. Like we look into the mind of God as we understand better the things that He has built, and it gives us, in my estimation, more and more reason to believe in God. And again, Lennox, my boy, I can say that. I shook his hand one time.
That's right. We both on the same day.
On
Yeah,
the same day. I shook his hand.
Lennox.
I shook his hand one time, but he makes the point that I don't retreat and say something like, "No, God must exist because we can't explain these things about the world." I don't say that God is real because of what we don't understand, but because of what we do. And you look at the world, and because people are scientific and have minds of engineering, and we see machines and we understand how systems work, that the more we investigate the world, we go, this is the result of an unimaginable intelligence and power. And it tells us more what He's like, and it reveals not just His. What does Paul say, right, in Romans? It says that we. I'll paraphrase.
Hey, you want to read it again?
Did you write that one down too?
That's the verse for Bailey to reflect on for the prayer.
Oh, okay.
For his invisible attributes and power are revealed in the things that are made.
Yep.
That's Romans 1:20. Namely, His eternal power in Godhead.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So we know God's power, and we can learn about His nature just by carefully observing the world around us, and it's amazing.
I think that's as good a place as any to land.
Can I add one thing?
No.
Please do.
Never mind.
Yes, add something.
So I think just like keeping in view, like we just talked about the gospel and like the 4 pillars of the gospel. And then like we see that, or we recognize that science is a common like blockade or roadblock
hang up,
to getting the gospel to be clear to someone's ears or heart. Just like realize that it's not a roadblock at all.
Yeah.
Like this, we couldn't shut up for a whole hour just because science isn't a roadblock. Like the world sees Christian faith and reason as foolishness,
right?
And we see the world's reason as foolishness. But like science is a tool that we have as Christians to meet the world on terms that they can speak in and understand. And instead of science being a roadblock, like, or a barrier between someone hearing the gospel and not hearing the gospel, science instead can be a thing that we turn to, something their ears understand, and a way that they can understand the gospel better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have more to say, but I won't add anything to that.
Yeah,
You're so good.
Well, and many Christian scientists who are alive today, including Cam's wife Whitney, and some examples I know of, like Seigart is a great one.
All my boys at Reason to Believe.
Right. Hugh Ross as well.
Yep. Fuzz Rana, Jeff Zwierink, the rest of the team. My boys.
Can attest to all that. And so I think that's awesome. I do want to read something from a worship song that I know touches all of our hearts. We actually played it at this church. And this is not obvious. This is a worship song. It's not Bible, but it is based on biblical ideas, surely. O Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all of the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. And then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I hope anybody watching enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and got to maybe learn how we think about some of these issues and how we might approach it in an evangelistic conversation and address some of the issues with thinking that science and faith are opposed to one another. So we hope you benefited from this, and we'll see you again next week when we tackle the problem of evil. God bless.
Thank you for watching this episode of Word First Radio. If you like the podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to learn more about Word First and how you can support the ministry spiritually and financially, check out the links in the description below. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Word First Radio, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.